Morning, friends. I got two scripture readings for you, so I hope you don't mind. First one's going to be Deuteronomy 18:15-20, and it reads, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. This is what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, 'If I hear the voice of the Lord my God any more, or ever see again this great fire, I will die.' Then the Lord replied to me, 'They are right in what they have said. I will raise up for them a prophet like you among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. Anyone who does not heed the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold accountable. But any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die." Just one more, if you don't mind. Mark 1:21-28. It says, "They went to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath came, he entered, Jesus, the synagogue, and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing in him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, 'What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him.' And at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee." May God add a blessing to the reading, to the hearing, and the living of his holy word. Thanks be to God. Friends, this is the last week, and maybe you're grateful that we are talking about Martin Luther King Jr. in his own words. Specifically, we've been talking about Martin Luther King in his own words because many people post things on social media, or you know about I Have a Dream, but maybe you've never read one of his sermons. Maybe you've never listened to one of his sermons, and there's plenty of chances out there on YouTube. But really what I wanted to, in order to draw this 3 weeks into a close, I wanted to get at Dr. King's gospel. And I can already hear, and maybe you'll be asking yourself, well, Don, isn't there one gospel? And let me try to make this point to you, right? Jesus Christ came some 2,000 years ago. He bled and he died for us for the forgiveness of sins. And that is largely, that is the gospel. But how Christians over the generations and over the ages have lived this gospel out, well, has varied. You don't have to look very far to see different denominations and people and Christians all over the world who embody this gospel in so many different ways. And so it's important, I think, to look back on history at particularly those movements where we can, in retrospect, say, hey, they got something right about what it means to be this Christian thing, and to include this gospel for me, both personally, but then also for our society at large. Which brings us to this. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote to his wife, Coretta Scott, about his beliefs as a minister. And he proclaimed this, and this is his own words. He said, "Let us continue to hope, work, and pray that in the future we will live to see a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race and color. This is the gospel that I will preach to the world." I think this is striking because we hear Dr. King in his own message as a minister of the gospel in 1952, before the civil rights movement begins. We kind of see this word, the fire that is pent up within, I believe, this prophet's bones of what he is going to bring to the world. And as we know, in retrospect, it was a force, and it is going to break down the color barrier in the United States. And that this movement, this gospel, often called the social gospel, is what helped to propel him, have that inward spirit to continue even in the midst of hard times. As a self-described advocator of the social gospel, Dr. King's theology was concerned, as he writes, with the whole man. Not just his soul, but his body as well. Not just his spiritual well-being, but his material well-being. Dr. King's ministry was built upon this gospel of the Protestant church at the turn of the 20th century, from his own family, his father and his grandfather, preaching a gospel about the very social conditions that their parishioners were facing. To give you a little bit of background, the early social gospel movement emerged during the rapidly industrializing American society in the early 1900s and right after the Civil War, recognizing that there were some injustices going on as capitalism was kind of running rampant and running workers into the ground. Some progressive ministers that just at the time prescribed a large dose of what they called practical Christianity to right the wrongs of the world and address the needs of the people in their own pews. One of the most prominent was a man by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch, who pastored a church in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. And that when they, I'm not talking about the Gordon Ramsay Hell's Kitchen. Hell's Kitchen was a district in New York in the late 20th century that saw many workers' rights abuses, and so these folks were coming into his church. And in Christianity, in this social crisis, Rauschenbusch traced the social gospel back to the lives, which is why I wanted to read the first text from Deuteronomy, to the Hebrew prophets. He insisted that in reading the prophets and reading folks like we just read in Deuteronomy, or we read in Isaiah or Nehemiah or Zechariah, that when we read these prophets, rather than ritualistic ceremonies, these prophets insisted, as in Rauschenbusch's words, insisted on a right life as the true worship with God, righteousness. And that right life included the belief that social problems are just moral problems on a very large scale. And that King would read this book, Walter Rauschenbusch's book, a book on Christianity and the social gospel, and wrote that its message left an indelible imprint on his thinking, giving him a theological basis for the social concern taught by his father and his grandfather. Social gospel proponent Henry Emerson Fosdick, popular pastor in New York's Riverside Church during the 1930s and 40s, was an early influence on Dr. King's preaching and thinking. This gentleman felt that the church that pretends to care for the souls of people but is not interested in the slums that damn them, the city government that corrupts them, or the economic order that cripples them, and international relationships that leading to peace or war determine the spiritual destiny of innumerable souls. He received that these churches would receive divine condemnation, and he also emphasized that the saving of society does depend on things which only high personal religion can supply. King would go on and he would pastor a place called Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and his parishioners would say that he came a firm believer in what is called the social gospel. King tied his faith to the nonviolent protests that characterized the Montgomery bus boycott and the freedom rides, as we've discussed the last couple of weeks, noting that Christ furnished the spirit and motivation within him and his followers for that boycott to push forward. And that Dr. Martin Luther King took task those churches that separated the secular realities of daily life from the spiritual things and the spiritual needs of people. And then his idea, his vision for the social gospel was that a church's role in social concerns was based on the early church's identity in his mind as an institution that shaped social mores and conditions at that time. And King believed that God would harshly judge the church's apathy on matters that were affecting people's well-being. I'm reminded that just this last Sunday, right ahead of church, that our church here, Crossroads United Methodist, is a warming center, was a warming center for folks. We remember it had those really dramatic temperature drops where we went below freezing, and we had worked with city officials to try to find out the best place, and they kind of asked if we could use our building, and we said, "No, of course." So we opened our doors for that. But when I came in the church, and I usually get to church around 6:30 on a given Sunday ahead of the oatmeal breakfast to see if there's anything that I can help with, get stuff ready for worship. When I came into the sanctuary, when I came into Wesley Hall last Sunday, there were 25, 30 folks just kind of scattered across Wesley Hall. We didn't have enough cots, and folks were sleeping on the floor, and we had food and things for the night, but I also knew that that condition was just going to be temporary. And I remember coming up for worship after talking with some folks down there, and they were concerned about how long they could stay, and these back and forths of it. And I remember coming up to worship, and worship just felt empty to me. Empty in a sense that while you try to get what you can to recharge from the singing and from prayers and corporate prayers, sometimes it just feels so empty when you know that the people that are in your congregation, or at that time literally in your church, have had nowhere to lay their head for months on end. to the make of a time where you're going to have to kick them back out into 30-degree weather that night. We see the realities and the harshness of our society, and I would be lying if I said that sometimes I don't come up with the frustration of the church realizing that these issues are actually a part of what the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that it wasn't just about a kind of personal holiness, but it was also about a kind of social holiness, and the two are inextricably linked with one another, and that we have to collectively do something about the ills that face this society and fight back when we as a collective people choose to band together to do things that harm one another, at least be apathetic to the sufferings of our communities. King remained a proponent of the social gospel despite many of the setbacks he would have in the civil rights movement and suffered under the late 1960s. But in a speech delivered the day before his death, King asserted that somehow the preacher must have a kind of fire shut up in his bones, and whenever injustice is around, he must tell it. Probably comes as no surprise to you that I'm also a proponent of this kind of gospel. The kind of gospel that says that when they went to Capernaum and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue to teach, to inform the man's mind or the humankind's mind and her heart, to give them the spiritual inward being to have the strength to go out into the world, but that he also had the authority to say the things. But when a man comes into the place with an unclean spirit, Jesus laid his hands on him in the here and now and healed him. He cared just as much about the physical well-being of people who came to them in the here and now as he did about saving people for the life hereafter. And I believe that same gospel that Jesus Christ lived in his day is still alive today, and it is pent up within the bones of this very church and the church across this world. If only we would have the bravery of the fire to let it out and do something about our war-ridden communities, poverty-stricken neighborhoods, and said, you know what, we will not stand for it anymore, because the gospel compels us to spread love into this world. And so if you weren't a proponent of the social gospel before, I encourage you, read Walter Rauschen's book, continue to read Martin Luther King Jr. in his own words, and then see when you read your New Testament that that is exactly what Jesus Christ did in his day, and he's calling us to do it now. Friends, in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, go in peace. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you back here next week.